Hey guys, how's it going? Today I wanted to talk about how the world is becoming a smaller place little by little. First of all, what do we have nowadays is we have people such as Elon Musk who are creating new inventions such as the Hyperloop. What does that mean? Well, the Hyperloop is a super fast bullet-like train that's actually in a tube, and it's getting its propulsion through magnets, and it can go at 700-800 miles per hour and probably even faster. And what happens is that if something like this comes into proper technology and gets mass produced, then you'd be able to, for example, go from LA to New York in 2 hours or less. What does that mean? That means that the world is becoming much smaller. People would be able to commute from one area of the country to the other on a daily basis just by taking a Hyperloop, maybe taking a nap on it for 2 hours a day, or living in more remote areas so they don't have to pay the enormous property taxes and the enormous rents and the enormous prices of just buying a property in a very busy area if they just accept to commute 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, maybe 3 hours a day in order to live in a much bigger house in the countryside. And obviously if you can go from New York to LA in 2 hours, that means that you could have a place that's maybe a 2-hour car ride, where maybe it's in the middle of the desert, let's say, in the middle of the countryside, and you could do that in 15 minutes. So now you can create much cheaper housing in places that are much more remote and much cheaper for people to buy, and they can just commute to these areas much faster. And at the same time, what happens is that now if they find ways of having these Hyperloops go in some form or another over the oceans or slightly under the oceans, I don't know how they would do it, but I know that they're talking about that kind of stuff, then you would be able to actually go from LA to Europe in maybe 4 hours, and even New York to Shanghai in that same amount of time, pretty much. So once again, the world gets smaller. If the world gets smaller, it's harder to keep people from going from one place to the other, and vice versa. So what happens is that I think if the world is getting smaller, then what happens to passports, what happens to countries? You could, especially in a place such as Europe, you could live in one country, work in another, and it wouldn't be a big deal if it was really so easy to have transportation. So that's kind of cool. But what about other places that are more closed, such as America, or some of the, a lot of the Asian countries where it's harder to get in because they want visas and they might be a little bit more communist and stuff like that. But also in America, it's really hard to get in and out. Easy to get out, not so easy to come in. For some people in some countries, you can go as a tourist, but working in it, getting the proper visa, that's a different thing. So what happens is that I think a lot of laws will change little by little by little, because the thing is, again, the world is getting so small little by little that it's what was once fantasy is not fantasy anymore. So I think what's going to have to happen eventually is either countries or ministers or kings and queens of whatever countries, presidents, etc., they're going to have to find a way to finally accept the fact that the world is actually small and that it needs to be part of the same earth, you know. So after all, if we can't do that, then it won't work. So what we need to do now is, I think, figure out a way to basically coexist better as human beings, because if we don't coexist well as human beings, what's going to happen is that there's going to be wars, and people are going to destroy themselves, and people will not accept each other, and people will eventually not be able to coexist, and great dramas are going to happen, because what's going to happen is that if the world is so small, people who live in very poor countries will say, hey, I can take a train for 1 hour. Why aren't you accepting me to work in that place? Why can't I just go there? I'm going to go back to my country at the end of the day, or at the end of the week if it's a little bit further. But they need my job. And then at the same time, maybe places that are third world countries, what can happen is that they can actually work themselves and in those poor countries, and maybe create some cool stuff over there, because they sometimes have like really cool resources that maybe we don't have access to. And if we don't have access to those resources, then maybe it's good to have those jobs right there, so normal people can just go to these places and create those jobs. But of course, the thing is that what needs to happen is that there needs to have less corruption. If there's so much corruption within all these leaders, well then it's not going to happen. And then also there has to be less greed from people who have these assets in these first world countries, because they know what they're doing. They know that they want to use the people from those third world countries at a cheaper price, and they know that they can get away with it. But what's crazy is that, for example, countries such as China, they have pretty cheap labor compared to other countries, and then throughout all these years of workshops and all these years of creating stuff, they've created an infrastructure that maybe other first world countries cannot compete with. And what's happening is that they're getting rich, and they're actually overcoming and kind of like taking over and buying all these properties in different places and all that stuff. So if we don't find a way to collaborate and actually finally accept the fact that we do live in a very small world, and we need to collaborate within countries and within people and within different societies, and just accept that we are just citizens of the world and not just citizens of a country, and actually citizens of the whole universe, because the universe is big. And again, what is fantasy can always become reality. And maybe not for thousands of years, but what if we do start colonizing other worlds? What if we do start spreading out in the universe, and then we have different worlds to live on, such as the moon, which is, of course, not a planet, but it's a moon. It's a satellite of the Earth. But what if we do have, for example, colonies there, and then we have colonies on Mars, and then colonies on comets? Who knows? But yeah, I mean, eventually it is going to happen, because all it takes is for a small group of people to be there, colonize the first thing, and then to procreate and create more and more on that place, and then eventually you have a huge colony on that place. And maybe because gravity is different there, maybe it's easier to send out shuttles from that area eventually, in the long term. And then they can explore more and more and more. Okay, well, that's it for my fantasy talk. Have a great day. Bye.